cool artist that I find from 20 years ago, and I'm like, and I Google them, I'll find an entire episode where you're talking about them. It's like the body of work you've assembled. And I guess I just kind of wonder, I mean, do you guys think of yourselves, I mean, are you podcasters / cartoonists? Are you cartoonists and then ... in? Yeah, we also do a podcast. Because it seems like this podcast has just gotten so big and so good.
I never think about that label, but I mean, it makes sense. We do, it's at least daily, if not multiple times a day.
Yeah, we joke about that, man. Dude, I think we're YouTubers, man.
We're also comic fans, and so much of comics history exists because of fandom. So I'm thrilled if we can talk about any artist and sort of continue that, because I think there are tons of great artists in comics history that have not gotten their due, or don't have a record online for somebody to Google and find. And so I'm thrilled if we're contributing to that, and we're both conscious of fandom and comics history in that way. So I'm thrilled if I'm adding to that.
We've been digging for comics our whole lives practically, and just amassed these ridiculous collections. Real estate is cheap in Pittsburgh, man. So you could keep those long boxes, man. And we would do these long drives to cons and just talk about, like, I have a lot of stuff, and I want to share it somehow. The idea before was like maybe Tumblr, like Power Comics, show the cover and do a little blurb or something. But hanging out and chatting about this stuff is cool, because we would kind of do that. We used to hang out every Wednesday for a lot of years in the aughts when we were all just getting started, and get your weekly comics and talk them. And we've been traveling to conventions together for 20 years, and it would always happen this way down at Heroes Con or something, where we're sitting around, Tom will be with us also a lot of time, and we would just start rapping about comics, just riffing, and like little crowds will just start coming around because we're cracking each other up, Tom's cracking us up, and it just is like attracting more nerd energy. And then we'd be the center of attention in this little ball, like it would just talk comics, and then other people would chime in. So it's like we already have practice before we even did our first episode. And I don't think about the label stuff either, but I think I spent 6 days drawing comics and then 1 day doing YouTube stuff. So the Cartoonist supersedes podcast, YouTube, whatever you want to call it.
Well, and of course, the body of work with the podcast is so much that I think, I mean, except for, the people who've been watching since the very beginning, it's like, I certainly can't say I've seen every single one, but.
Please have your attention. Cartoon Crossword Columbus will be ending in 30 minutes.
Yep. But one of the recurring themes is this, the way you guys discuss some of the 90s stuff that gets criticized a lot by others. This way, kind of talking about artists like Rob Liefeld, talking about like Todd McFarlane, and just taking a look at their work and really just kind of looking at what's on the page. Is this conversations you were having before offline, and do you find, that's kind of, it's not unusual to hear people talk about how both of those guys are, not, their work gets criticized a lot.
I loved in the Michel Fiffe shoot interview when he said the phrase, like borrowed opinions or something like that, in regards to a lot of the chatter online. And when the first comment is about feet or anatomy, like I just laugh at that. It's like, let's put some tracing paper over top of Jack Kirby if we're going to have that conversation.
Yeah.
That like, what are you talking about here?
There's a weird magic in comics. Like you mentioned Fletcher Hanks a little bit ago. If anybody is unfamiliar with Fletcher Hanks, see our episode on Fletcher Hanks. But he was a golden age cartoonist, and he drew characters that weren't anatomically correct and perspective wasn't right, but it had this unique flair and voice. And that's the beauty of comics. So the people that want to criticize Rob Liefeld for bad anatomy, good thing he's not a doctor. That's the nice thing is we don't have to worry about that. In some ways that has no bearing on whether the comic's any good or not. And by the way, I don't want to endorse Rob Liefeld comics as being great comics, because they have their place, and that's not exactly what I'm saying. But being critical of his anatomy has nothing to do with whether a comic works or not. And in fact, A lot of the comics where you could say like everything's drawn perfectly, boring,
Yep.
really boring. And I mean, there's a genre of artists in comics that are doing a lot of reference, you know, heavily reference. So great, it's super accurate. I am not interested in those comics. I can look out the window and see that for myself, or take pictures on my phone and see that, or Google image search and see it. I want the oddness, I want the weirdness. My favorite part of comics, without a doubt, is that it can be the work of one person. It can come from their brain through words and pictures into my brain. And so I want the peculiar parts and qualities and weirdness and stuff. And it's okay if that comic doesn't work for you, by the way. I don't need anyone else to feel the same way, but that's part of the reason that I like these weird comics, you know? One thing about a Rob Liefeld comics, they're weird, they're strange, you know,
I
they're
think
nothing
of him as
different
a,
than Hulk.
yeah, I think of him as a Fletcher Hanks in a way.
It's outsider art, you know,
Yeah.
and I think you could say the same thing about Jack Kirby in a lot of ways. Like, that dude figured out ways to draw that were uniquely Jack Kirby, and you know what, that's what I love about Jack Kirby comics, is that they're Jack Kirby.
Specifically, when we talk about McFarlane or Liefeld, there is an inspirational quality to their work for me as I was growing up, like in my formative years, just knowing that I wanted to draw comics. At the same time, I was picking those things up off the spinner rack. They had reprints of the Tales from the Crypt. You know, the HBO show was on, and Russ Cochran was able to get newsstand distribution for EC Comics, and I would get those too. And I was in that phase of copying art, and you cannot successfully copy a Wally Wood science fiction face that's double lit and all the bells and whistles that guy was able to draw. It made me feel like hopeless. Like, there's no way I'm ever going to be able to draw comics when I grow up. I might have to cash it in. But then when I see that the dude on the Levi's commercial, like I get his comics, and I can kind of like, that's very attainable. I'm gonna be able to get there one day, no doubt. You know, same with McFarlane and everything. So it holds that spirit for me, and that's, you know, I mean, they were very, very popular comics for a reason. I wasn't a part of any fandom. It took me 21 years to have somebody to talk about comics with. And I was picking that stuff up cold, you know, nobody told me to pick it up. I'm like, wow, this looks not boring. You know, that was the era of the house style, when there was a lot of like ersatz, John Buscema looking guys.
Mm-hmm.
And just I was gravitating to the weird stuff that just didn't look like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's also like, we want to eat, you know, we want to have a roof over our heads. Those guys sold a lot of comics, and that can't be discounted. Even if you look at that stuff and say it's not high art or whatever, that's fine. But if you look at comics history, you've got to acknowledge those guys, because like, they did stuff that nobody else had done, and not just in cells. They then put their money where their mouth was and started Image Comics, completely changing everything, you know, for us. I would always say, like, my dream when I was, you know, 12 or something was I wanted to grow up and draw Wolverine and Hulk. Whenever they find Image Comics, then my dream is I want to create my own characters and grow up and draw my own books. And you know, that counts for a lot in my world. So if your art's maybe okay, you get a couple extra points for that.
Mm-hmm. So I have one more thing, and then I want to leave plenty of time for questions. I'm curious, with you guys are able to